The wind howled through the pines like a chorus of lost souls, and Thomas Brennan knew the storm would come before nightfall. He could feel it in the air, in the heavy dampness that clung to his skin, and the smell of damp earth rising from the forest floor. At 52, Thomas had spent 3 decades in those Oregon mountains, long enough to read the sky like other men read newspapers. He wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his gloved hand and watched the tree before him, a Douglas fir over 100 years old, rising majestically against the darkening sky. The chainsaw purred in his hands as he switched it off, and the sudden silence of the forest enveloped him like a blanket. Thomas had never quite gotten used to that moment, when the mechanical roar ceased and nature began to speak again. The distant call of a crow, the rustling of leaves, the snapping of branches in the distance. It was as if the forest were always watching, always waiting. He checked the cut he had made at the base of the trunk. It was clean, precise, exactly at the right angle. In 3 decades, Thomas had never carelessly felled a tree. His father had taught him that respecting the wood was respecting life itself. A tree takes 100 years to grow and you fell it in minutes, old Brennan used to say. The least you can do is treat it with dignity. The radio hanging from his belt crackled. "Brennan, this is base. Can you hear me?" Thomas pressed the button. "I'm here, Charlie." "The forecast has changed. They say the storm will be worse than we thought. You need to get down from the mountain now." Thomas looked up at the sky. The clouds were a dark, swollen mass, moving too fast. "Understood. I'm finishing up here, and I'll be right down." "Don't finish anything. Leave it for tomorrow and come down now. That's an order." But Thomas knew he couldn't just leave that tree unfinished. It was on the Petersons' property, and they had specifically requested that fir tree to build the new barn. They were already late, and Thomas hated being late. He pressed the button again. 10 minutes, Charlie. I just need 10 minutes." The silence on the other end lasted too long. Then Charlie sighed. "Your 10 minutes. After that, I'm not responsible if you have to spend the night in the woods." Thomas smiled. Charlie had always been too dramatic. He started the chainsaw again and positioned himself. The final cut had to be perfect. It had to direct the fall away from the other trees into a clearing where the trunk could fall without destroying anything around it. It was a dance he knew by heart, a ritual he had performed thousands of times. The blade bit into the wood, and sawdust flew through the air like golden snow. Thomas could feel the vibration rising up his arms, the familiar scent of fresh resin filling his nostrils. He was almost there, almost where the tree would begin to give way, when he heard the crack. It wasn't the crack he expected, the soft sound of wood fibers beginning to break under the tree's own weight. It was a sharp, loud crack coming from above. Thomas looked up, and his heart froze. One of the dead branches at the top of the fir tree, weakened by years of harsh weather, had broken off, and it was falling directly towards him. Instinct took over. Thomas dropped the chainsaw and leaped to the side, his feet slipping on the blanket of damp pine needles. He felt the wind from the branch pass inches from his head, heard the heavy impact as it hit the ground, exactly where Thomas had been seconds before. But in his desperate dive, his right foot caught on an exposed root, and he felt something snap in his ankle, a sharp, white pain that shot up his leg like liquid fire. Thomas fell heavily, rolling over the needles and the earth. For a moment, he just lay there, breathing heavily, his heart pounding against his ribs. The pain in his ankle pulsed in waves, each one worse than the last. He tried to get up and almost fainted when he put weight on his foot. Something was very, very wrong. He sat down slowly, leaning against a rock, and examined his ankle. Even through the thick boot he could see the swelling. When he tried to move his foot, the pain was so intense that bile rose in his throat. Fractured, no doubt. And he was alone in the forest, miles from the nearest road, the radio. Thomas grabbed it from his belt, But when he looked at the screen, his stomach sank. The device was cracked, the screen flickering erratically before going completely dark. He must have smashed the device when he fell. He tried to turn it on again, but there was no response. He was dead. The first raindrops began to fall, thick and cold. Within minutes they had become a solid curtain of water. Thomas looked around, trying to think despite the pain clouding his mind. His truck was parked 4 kilometers away, down the mountain trail. With his broken ankle, it would be impossible to reach it before darkness fell. And even if he could, the rain was already turning the trail into mud. He could easily get lost or have another accident. No, he had to find shelter. Wait for the storm to pass. Charlie knew more or less where he was working. When Thomas didn't show up at the base, they would come looking for him. He just needed to survive until then. Thomas looked at the tree he had been felling. It was still standing, but the cut was too deep to be safe. With the storm, it could fall at any moment, in any direction. He couldn't stay there. Using the chainsaw for support, Thomas forced himself to stand, balancing on one leg. Each movement sent new waves of pain through his body, but he gritted his teeth and began to move. There was a rock formation about 200 meters away. He remembered seeing it that morning. If he was lucky, there would be an overhang, something that offered protection from the rain. 200 meters had never seemed so far. Thomas used the chainsaw as an improvised crutch, dragging himself from tree to tree, supporting himself on logs and rocks. Sweat mingled with the rain on his face, and he had to stop several times when the pain became too unbearable. The forest around him had transformed into a strange and hostile place. The trees he knew so well now seemed menacing, their shadows lengthened by the ever-diminishing light. The wind had picked up, making the branches sway and groan like living creatures. Thomas knew he needed to stay calm. That panic was his true enemy now, but it was difficult not to feel the growing pressure of fear in his chest. He thought of Sarah, his wife. She would be waiting for him at home, probably already worried about the storm. They had an unspoken agreement, never spoken aloud but understood by both. Thomas would always return home. 30 years in the forest, and he had always returned. He couldn't break that promise now. The rock formation finally emerged through the curtain of rain, a dark, solid mass against the stormy sky. Thomas crawled toward it, his muscles trembling with exhaustion and pain. And there, like a gift from heaven, was exactly what he had hoped to find. A cavity beneath a rock overhang, deep enough to shelter him from the rain, high enough for him to sit comfortably. Thomas crawled inside, finally allowing himself to collapse against the rock wall. For long minutes, he just lay there, breathing heavily, waiting for his heart to slow down. The pain in his ankle was constant now, a deep, nauseating throbbing. He knew he needed to immobilize it, but first he needed to warm up. His clothes were soaked and even protected from the direct rain. The cold was beginning to seep into his bones. Hypothermia was a real risk. Thomas looked around the cavity. Some dry leaves were piled up in a corner, protected from the moisture by the rocky overhang. Dry branches, too, gathered by the wind. If he could make a fire, he would have a chance. The lighter in his pocket still worked, thank God. His fingers were so cold he could barely hold it, but after several attempts he managed to light the dry leaves. The small, flickering flame was the most beautiful thing Thomas had ever seen. He carefully fed it with thin twigs, then with larger pieces of wood, until he had a modest but steady fire crackling at the entrance to the cavity. The light and the heat changed everything. The cavity ceased to be a dark and frightening hole and became a refuge, a safe place amidst the chaos of the storm. Thomas reached out his hands toward the flames, feeling life slowly returning to his numb fingers. Now he could think more clearly. He could plan. First, the ankle. Thomas carefully removed his boot, biting his lip to keep from screaming when the leather scraped against the swelling. His ankle was purple and swollen to twice its normal size, definitely broken, possibly in more than one place. He tore strips from his flannel shirt and used 2 straight branches to make a makeshift splint, tying it all together with the rope he always carried in his work bag. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than nothing. At least now his ankle was immobilized, and the pain had lessened from constant agony to a tolerable throbbing. Thomas leaned back against the rock wall and let out a long sigh. He was alive. He was injured and trapped, but he was alive. It was a start. Night fell like a heavy curtain, and with it came an even more intense cold. The campfire kept the worst at bay, but Thomas knew he couldn't sleep. Not because of the concussion he suspected he'd suffered in the fall, and not because of the risk of the fire going out. He methodically fed the flames, using the branches he could reach without leaving the cavity. Between the pain and the cold and the loneliness, Thomas's thoughts began to wander. He found himself remembering how he had come to be there, not just that night, but in this life. He thought of his father, James Brennan, who had brought him to the forest for the first time when Thomas was only 8 years old. The old man was a lumberjack too, just like his grandfather before him. It was a lineage of men who lived among the trees, who knew the forest as others knew the streets of their cities. The forest gives you everything, his father used to say, but it also takes away. You need to respect it, Tommy. Always. Thomas had learned this lesson early on. He had seen men injured by their own negligence, trees falling in the wrong directions, poorly maintained equipment causing terrible accidents. He had also seen men who simply disappeared into the forest, swallowed by the vast green expanse as if they had never existed. The forest was generous, but it was not kind. It did not forgive mistakes. And now, after 30 years of care, of respect, of doing everything right, here he was, trapped, wounded, alone. Thomas felt a pang of anger, not against the forest, but against himself. He should have listened to Charlie. He should have come down the mountain when he had the chance. His stubbornness, his pride in always finishing the job had almost killed him. A wolf howled in the distance, a long, mournful sound that echoed through the trees. Thomas stiffened, his hand instinctively moving to the knife at his belt. Wolves rarely attacked humans, he knew that, but a wounded man unable to flee was a different kind of prey. He threw more wood on the fire, making the flames rise higher. The fire would keep the animals at bay. The hours dragged on. The storm raged relentlessly outside, and Thomas began to question whether Charlie and the others could actually reach him. The roads would be impassable, and even with all-terrain vehicles, it would be dangerous to attempt a search during the storm. They might have to wait until morning, which meant Thomas would have to spend the entire night there, tending the fire, battling the pain and cold and the growing sense of isolation. It was sometime after midnight. Thomas estimated from the position of the moon when it briefly appeared between the clouds that he heard the sounds. Not the wind, not the animals. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, moving through the wet forest. Thomas straightened up, all his senses alert. Could it be that the rescue team had already arrived? "Here!" he shouted, his voice hoarse. "I'm here!" The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was oppressive, heavy with expectation. Thomas waited, his heart pounding. And then the footsteps began again, not approaching but receding. He shouted again, louder this time, but there was no answer. The footsteps disappeared into the distance, swallowed by the storm. Thomas sat down again, dejected. It was probably a deer or an elk, he told himself. The forest was full of animals, and his senses, clouded by pain and exhaustion, might have misinterpreted the sounds. But a part of him, a primal and superstitious part that he usually kept buried, whispered other possibilities. The forest was ancient, much older than the men who inhabited it, and ancient things sometimes harbored mysteries that could not be easily explained. He mentally reprimanded himself. That was fear speaking, loneliness distorting his perception. He was Thomas Brennan, a lumberjack for 3 decades, a practical and down-to-earth man. He didn't believe in ghost stories or mystical creatures of the forest, but even so, he threw more wood on the fire and kept his knife close at hand. As the first grey light of dawn began to filter through the trees, Thomas felt something inside him relax. He had made it through the night. The storm had finally subsided to a light drizzle, and the sounds of the awakening forest were comforting and familiar. Birds sang, water dripped from the leaves, and somewhere nearby, a squirrel chattered irritably. The campfire had dwindled to embers, and Thomas was about to stoke it again when he heard a sound that made his heart leap with hope. An engine, distant but unmistakable. A vehicle moving through the forest, probably one of the logging company's jeeps. Thomas grabbed a wet branch and placed it on the embers, creating a thick column of smoke. He waved his red coat in the air, shouting with all the strength he could muster, "Here! I'm here!" The engine grew louder, then stopped. There was a moment of agonizing silence, and then the most beautiful voice Thomas had ever heard echoed through the trees. "Thomas! Thomas Brennan! Where are you?" "Here!" Thomas shouted back, his voice breaking. "On the rock formation!" Minutes later, which seemed like hours, Charlie emerged from the vegetation, accompanied by 2 paramedics. The old foreman's face was pale and tense, but it lit up when he saw Thomas. "My God, man," Charlie murmured, kneeling beside him. "We thought you were going to die here." "Not yet," Thomas replied, trying to smile despite the pain. "Not yet." The paramedics worked efficiently, checking his vital signs, examining his ankle, and preparing him for transport. One of them, a young woman with kind eyes, complimented his improvised splint. "You did a good job here. You probably prevented more serious damage by keeping his ankle stable." They placed him on a stretcher and began to carry him down the mountain. It was a slow and careful process, navigating the treacherous terrain, still slippery from the rain. Thomas looked back one last time at the rock formation that had been his refuge. It seemed smaller in the daylight, less imposing. But he knew he would never forget it. The drive to the hospital in Portland took 3 hours, and all the way there, Thomas remained silent, watching the forest pass by the ambulance window. It seemed different now somehow, still familiar, still beautiful, but also wilder, more indifferent. He had been reminded violently that the forest was not his friend. It wasn't his enemy either. It was simply indifferent, a place of brutal beauty and constant danger. At the hospital, they discovered his ankle was broken in 2 places and would require surgery. There would be months of recovery, physical therapy, and uncertainty about whether he would ever be able to return to the hard work in the forests. Sarah was there when he woke from the anesthesia, his face stained with tears but smiling. She held his hand and said nothing. She didn't need to. The relief in his eyes said it all. The weeks that followed were a blur of pain, medication, and endless boredom. Thomas discovered that he hated being trapped inside, hated the dependence, hated the uncertainty. But he also discovered something else, something he hadn't expected. Gratitude. He was alive. He could have died in that forest, from hypothermia or his wounds, or simply from loneliness and despair. But he didn't die. He had survived, and that meant something. Charlie visited regularly, bringing company news and gossip about the other lumberjacks. On one of these visits, he mentioned something that made Thomas straighten up in bed. "You know that fir tree you were cutting down?" Charlie said casually. "It fell during the storm. It fell exactly where you planned, right into the clearing. It didn't even scratch a tree around it. It was the most perfect cut I've ever seen, considering you didn't even finish the job." Thomas remained silent for a long moment. There was something profoundly satisfying about it, something he couldn't quite explain. Even wounded, even fleeing for his life, he had done the job correctly. The tree had fallen as it should. There was dignity in that. It took 4 months before Thomas could walk without crutches, and another 2 before doctors cleared him for moderate physical work. Sarah tried to convince him to retire, find an office job at the company, or perhaps try something completely different. But Thomas knew, even before he was fully recovered, that he would return to the forest. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to. The forest was a part of him, just as he was a part of it. That terrible night hadn't changed that. It had only made him more aware of it. He had respected the forest before, but now he understood it in a new way. He understood its indifference, its dangerousness, but also its relentless beauty. His first day back at work was a clear autumn day, the air fresh and clean, the sky an impossibly blue. Charlie had insisted on going with him just to make sure you don't do anything stupid, but they both knew it was more than that. It was a ritual, a way to mark his return. They drove to the same area where Thomas had been injured, and he insisted on walking to the rock formation. His legs still ached sometimes, especially on cold or rainy days, but he could walk. He could work. That was what mattered. The cavity in the rock was exactly as he had left it, though it seemed somehow smaller, less significant. The ashes from his campfire had long since been washed away by the rain, and the forest had reclaimed the space, as it always did. Nature did not keep memories in the same way that men did. "You're lucky to be alive," Charlie said softly, looking around. "I know," Thomas replied, and he did know. He knew in a deep, visceral way that transcended words. He looked at the surrounding trees, at the sunlight filtering through the branches, at the shadows dancing on the forest floor. And he felt something he hadn't felt in months: peace. Thomas gradually returned to work, starting with lighter tasks, working his way back to full-scale tree felling. He found he was more careful now, more deliberate. He checked the weather more often, never worked alone in remote areas, and always made sure his radio was working. They weren't dramatic changes, but they were important. And there was something else. He had started teaching. The company was training new lumberjacks, young people full of energy and confidence, but lacking experience. Charlie asked Thomas to supervise them, and to his surprise, Thomas discovered that he enjoyed it. He enjoyed passing on what his father had taught him. He enjoyed seeing these young people learn to respect the forest, to understand that each tree had a story, that each felling was a responsibility. One of these young men, a 23-year-old named Jake, reminded Thomas of himself at that age, enthusiastic, hard-working, eager to prove his worth. One day, a few months after Thomas had returned to work, Jake made a mistake. It wasn't a big mistake, but it was the kind of mistake that could lead to something worse. He hadn't properly checked the landing area and almost hit a power line hidden among the trees. Thomas stopped him before any harm was done, but he saw the fear in the young man's eyes when he realized how close he had come to disaster. Instead of reprimanding him, Thomas led Jake to a fallen log and sat with him. And then, for the first time, Thomas told his story. He told of that night in the storm, of his broken ankle, of the loneliness and fear and the struggle to survive. Jake listened in silence, his eyes wide. When Thomas finished, the young man was quiet for a long moment. Then he said softly, "You came back. Even after all this, you came back." "Yes," Thomas replied, "because that's what we do. We don't give up. The forest knocks you down, but you get back up. You learn, and you keep going." It was a simple philosophy, Thomas knew. There was nothing particularly profound or original about it, but it was true. It was the essence of who he was, of who his father had been, of all the lumberjacks who came before and who would come after. They were people who didn't give up. Years passed. Thomas continued working in the forest, his body slower but his mind sharper. his experience compensating for what he had lost in youthful strength. He saw trends change, new equipment introduced, old techniques abandoned. But some things remained the same. The forest was still the forest. The trees still grew, majestic and indifferent, and men still came to cut them down, to transform wood into houses and furniture and paper. There had been other accidents over the years, though none as dramatic as that night. Thomas had learned to recognize the warning signs early on, to trust his instincts when something didn't seem right. And he taught those instincts to others, creating a new generation of lumberjacks who respected the forest as much as they feared it. When Thomas finally retired at 65, it was on his own terms. His body was still strong enough for the work, but he felt it was time to make room for the younger generation, time to pass the baton. His last day in the forest was quiet and simple. He didn't fell any trees, just walked the trails he knew so well, touching the trunks, feeling the texture of the bark under his hands. Charlie, now also retired but still occasionally showing up to help with training, walked with him. "Will you miss this?" he asked. Thomas thought for a moment. "Every day," he admitted, "but it's time. And anyway, the forest will always be here. I can visit it whenever I want. I just won't be working in it." "You left your mark," Charlie said. 35 years. And how many trees did you cut down? Thousands, tens of thousands." "I never counted," Thomas replied. "It wasn't about the numbers. It was about doing the job right, about respecting the forest, about not giving up even when things got tough." They stayed there for a while, two old men in an ancient forest, surrounded by trees that had existed before they were born and would continue to exist long after they were gone. And Thomas felt a sense of completeness, of a circle being closed. He had come to the forest as an 8-year-old boy, holding his father's hand. He had grown up here, matured here, almost died here. And now he was leaving, not with regrets, but with gratitude. Thomas Brennan's story could have ended there, with his retirement, with him peacefully fading into a well-deserved sunset. But life is rarely that simple or tidy. 2 years after his retirement, the logging company Thomas had worked for decades faced a crisis. New environmental regulations had severely limited where they could cut, and the business was suffering. There was talk of selling it, perhaps closing it down altogether. For Thomas, who had dedicated his life to the work, this was devastating. It wasn't just about his own legacy, although that mattered. It was about all the men and women who still worked there, about Jake and the other young people he had trained. It was about preserving a way of life that was disappearing. So Thomas did something he never imagined he would do. At 67 years old, with grey hair and a leg that still ached on cold days, he began to fight, not physically, but in other ways. He attended city council meetings, spoke with regulators, and passionately argued for the importance of responsible forest management. He explained that well-managed forests were not enemies of the environment, but allies. The trees could be harvested sustainably, allowing forests to regenerate and thrive. It wasn't easy. There was a lot of mistrust, a lot of old wounds between environmentalists and loggers. But Thomas had something that many others didn't: credibility. He had spent 35 years in the forest, not destroying it, but working with it. He knew every species of tree, every growth pattern, every sign of health or disease in the forest, and he spoke with a passion that couldn't be faked. Slowly, things began to change. Compromises were reached. New areas were designated for sustainable harvesting, with rigorous replanting and monitoring plans. The company not only survived, but began to thrive again, this time with a model that balanced economic needs with environmental responsibility. Thomas didn't do it alone, of course. There were many other people involved, many negotiations and concessions, but he had been an important voice, perhaps even a decisive one. Jake, now 30 years old and an experienced lumberjack himself, visited Thomas one spring afternoon. They sat on the deck of the house Thomas and Sarah had built on the edge of the forest, drinking coffee and watching the pine trees sway gently in the breeze. "You saved the company," Jake said. "You saved our jobs. I don't know if I've thanked you properly for that ever." Thomas shook his head. "It wasn't just me, and besides, I didn't do it for the jobs. I mean, that was important, of course, but I did it for the forest. It deserved to be treated with respect, not to be closed off forever or exploited to the point of destruction. It deserved a balance." Jake smiled. "You still think like a lumberjack, even in retirement." "Once a lumberjack, always a lumberjack," Thomas replied, and realized it was true. This wasn't just a job he'd done. It was part of who he was, something that had shaped every aspect of his life. Sarah appeared in the doorway, drying her hands on a dish towel. She was 70 years old now, her hair completely white, but her eyes still sparkled with the same gentle humor that Thomas had fallen in love with 40 years ago. "Jake, are you staying for dinner? I made enough stew for an army." "I'd love to, Mrs. Brennan," Jake replied. During dinner, the conversation flowed easily, moving from stories of the forest to future plans, from old memories to new possibilities. Jake spoke about his own family, his 5-year-old daughter who already showed a fascination with trees. "Maybe I'll take her to the forest next year," he said. "Start teaching her, just like you taught me." Thomas felt a tightness in his chest, an emotion he couldn't immediately name. It was pride, yes, but also something more. It was the feeling of continuity, that something he valued was being passed on, would survive beyond him. "Do it," he said softly. "But teach her about respect before you teach her about cutting. Teach her to listen to the forest before you teach her to transform it." After Jake left, Thomas and Sarah sat together on the deck, wrapped in blankets against the night's chill. The moon was full, bathing the forest in silvery light. The trees stretched out into the distance, a dark living mass that breathed and grew and existed independently of the men who occasionally visited it. "Have you ever thought about that night?" Sarah asked suddenly. She didn't need to specify which night. There was only one that mattered, one that had changed everything. "Sometimes," Thomas admitted, "not as much as I used to. But yes, I think about her. I wonder what would have happened if I had listened to Charlie, if I had gone down the mountain when he told me. Everything would have been different." "Do you regret it?" Thomas thought carefully before answering. "No," he finally said. "I could have died, it's true. And there were times, especially in the first few months after the accident, when I was angry at myself for being so stubborn. But that night taught me something important. It taught me about limits, about humility, about the fact that no matter how experienced you are, the forest will always be stronger. And I think I needed to learn that. It made me a better lumberjack, but also a better person." Sarah took his hand, intertwining their fingers. "You've always been a good person, Tom, but I agree, you changed after that night. You became more, I don't know, more present perhaps, more aware of how precious all of this is." They sat in silence for a long time, simply observing the forest under the moonlight. And Thomas realized that this was the perfect moment. This was the kind of peace he had struggled to achieve that terrible night in the storm. Not the absence of hardship, but the presence of something deeper, purpose, connection, continuity. The years continued to pass, as they always do. Thomas celebrated his 70th birthday, surrounded by family and friends, many of them fellow retired lumberjacks like himself. There were jokes about age, bad knees, and failing memory, but there was also respect. Respect for a life well lived, for work well done, for challenges faced and overcome. His health began to decline gradually. At first, it was just small things, more aches and pains, more fatigue. But then came the diagnosis no one wants to hear: cancer. The doctor said it was treatable, that he had a good chance, but at 72, Thomas knew that good chances were no guarantee. He faced the illness the same way he had faced everything in his life, with silent determination, with a refusal to give up, with the same stubbornness that had almost killed him that night in the forest, but that had also saved him. There was surgery, chemotherapy, bad days, and worse days. But there were also good days, days when he could walk in the forest with Sarah, feel the sun on his face, hear the birds singing. During one of those good days, about a year after the diagnosis, Thomas asked Sarah to drive to that place. She knew which place without him needing to explain. The rock formation where he had spent that terrible night, where he had fought for survival and won. The journey there was more difficult now than it used to be, not only because of age or illness, but because Thomas had to stop frequently to catch his breath. But he persisted, refusing to give up, and eventually they arrived. The cavity in the rock was exactly as he remembered it, though it seemed to have shrunk even more, or perhaps it was he who had grown, not physically but in other ways. He sat on the same rock where he had leaned that night, and closed his eyes, letting the memories return. The fear, the pain, the cold, but also the determination, the will to survive, the refusal to give up. "Thank you," he whispered to the forest, though he wasn't sure exactly what he was thanking it for. Perhaps for the lesson it had taught him, perhaps for allowing him to survive, perhaps simply for existing, for being that constant, indifferent presence that had defined his life. Sarah sat beside him, and they stayed there for a long time, simply existing together in that space that meant so much. When they finally stood to leave, Thomas looked back one last time. He knew, though he hadn't said it aloud, that he would probably never return there. His body was weakening. The disease was progressing despite the treatments. This was his farewell. But it wasn't a sad farewell. It was a farewell of gratitude, of recognition, of peace with the circle being closed. He had come to the forest as a boy, grown up in it as a man, almost died in it, and now he was saying goodbye to it. It was appropriate. It was right. The following months were a mix of highs and lows. There were times when Thomas thought he could win, that his stubbornness could overcome even the cancer. But there were other times, increasingly frequent, when he knew the truth. He was losing this battle, and surprisingly, he was at peace with it. On a clear autumn morning, almost exactly 3 years after that stormy night, Thomas woke before dawn. Sarah was still sleeping beside him, and he lay there for a moment, just watching her, memorizing every detail of her face. Then, carefully, he got out of bed. His body ached, every movement was an effort, but he managed to get dressed and go out onto the deck. The sky was beginning to lighten in the east, painting the clouds pink and gold. The forest was awakening, birds beginning to sing, the wind whispering through the pines. Thomas sat in his favorite chair and simply observed. He watched the light change, watched the sun rise over the trees, watched the forest transform from shadows to light. And he felt a deep and overwhelming gratitude for it all, for each day, each tree, each challenge, and each victory, for Sarah, for her work, for her life. Sarah found him there an hour later, still sitting, still watching. She knew immediately from the way he sat, from the expression on his face, that something had changed. She knelt beside him, taking his hand. "It's beautiful," Thomas said softly. "It's always been so beautiful, and I didn't always realize it." "I know," Sarah replied, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't give up," Thomas continued. "I want you to know that. I fought as hard as I could. But sometimes—" He paused, searching for the right words. "Sometimes not giving up means knowing when to stop fighting. It means accepting. It means letting go." Sarah squeezed her hand tighter, unable to speak through her tears. And together, they watched the sun continue to rise, the forest continue to awaken, life continue as it always would, indifferent yet beautiful, relentless yet magnificent. Thomas Brennan died 3 weeks later at home, surrounded by family. Until the end, he refused to complain, refused to become bitter. He had lived the life he wanted, the way he wanted, and had no regrets. Perhaps that was the true lesson the forest had taught him that terrible night. Not only that he shouldn't give up, but that never giving up meant facing each challenge with dignity, with courage, with respect for something greater than himself. His funeral was simple, as he would have wanted. There were many people, current and retired lumberjacks, people he had trained, people who simply knew and respected him. Jake gave a eulogy, his voice breaking with emotion, as he spoke of the man who had taught him not only how to cut down trees, but how to live with integrity and purpose. He once told me, Jake said, that the forest knocks you down, but you get back up, you learn, and you keep going. That was Thomas Brennan's philosophy, and it's the philosophy I try to live by every day. Thomas's ashes were scattered in the forest he loved, near the rock formation where he had spent that transformative night. Sarah remained there alone after everyone had left. Just her and the forest, and the ashes of the man she had loved for almost 50 years. "You're home now," she whispered, "finally home." And the forest continued as it always had, indifferent yet eternal, its trees growing and dying and growing again in an endless cycle. But if you visited that place, that rock formation on a mountain in Oregon, perhaps you could feel something, not something supernatural or mystical, but something simpler and deeper. The presence of a man who had lived with purpose, who had faced challenges without giving up, who had respected the land that had sustained him. Years later, when Jake took his daughter to the forest for the first time, he took her to that place. The girl was 8 years old now, the same age Thomas had been when his father had first brought him there, continuing a cycle that had begun generations before. "This is a special place," Jake told her, kneeling down to be at her eye level. "A very wise man taught me about the forest, about respecting it and taking care of it. And he learned that here in a way. This place taught him about never giving up, about being strong even when things get tough." The girl looked around, her eyes wide with wonder. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Yes," Jake agreed. "It is, and you know what's even more beautiful? These trees will be here long after we're gone. They'll keep growing, they'll keep being home to animals and birds. They'll keep cleaning the air and providing shade. If we take good care of them, if we respect them, they'll be here for your grandchildren to see." And then he began to teach her, just as Thomas had taught him. Not about how to cut down trees, not yet, but about how to listen to the forest, how to read its signs, how to understand that it was something alive and precious and worthy of respect. The girl absorbed everything with the enthusiasm of youth, asking questions, touching the trees, marveling at each new discovery. As Jake watched her explore, he thought of Thomas and smiled. The old lumberjack was gone, but his legacy continued. Not only in the trees he had helped to manage responsibly, not only in the men and women he had trained, but in this girl and the generations that would come after her. The circle continued, as it always would, and perhaps that was the true story of Thomas Brennan. Not only that, he never gave up when faced with death on that cold, stormy night, but that he lived his entire life with that same determination, that same refusal to give up on what was important. He fought for the forest, he fought for his work, he fought to do things the right way. And in the end, even though he knew he was losing his last battle, he didn't give up on living with dignity until the very end. The forest remained, as it always would. The trees grew taller, their trunks thickened, their branches reached the sky. New saplings sprouted where old trees had fallen, and the cycle of life and death and renewal continued, relentless and beautiful. And somewhere in that vast green expanse, perhaps there is an echo of Thomas Brennan, not a ghost or a spirit, but something simpler and more real. The memory of a man who understood that true strength lies not in never falling, but in always getting back up. That dignity lies not in never facing challenges, but in facing them with courage. That living well means respecting the world around you and leaving it a little better than you found it. This is the story of the lumberjack who never gave up. But more than that, it's the story of how a man found meaning in his work, purpose in his struggles, and peace in accepting both life and death as natural parts of something greater than himself. It's a story about resilience, yes, but also about humility, about strength, but also about knowing when to yield, about never giving up, but also about understanding what is truly worth fighting for. And as the forest continues to grow, as new lumberjacks learn their craft, as the cycle of seasons relentlessly continues, Thomas Brennan's lesson remains. It is not written in stone or engraved in bronze. It is in the trees he helped manage, in the people he taught, in the lives he touched. It is in the way Jake teaches his daughter to respect the forest, in the way that girl will one day teach her own children. Because in the end, the true measure of a life isn't how long you live, how many trees you cut down, or how many battles you win. It's in the legacy you leave behind, the lessons you pass on, and how you treat the world and the people around you. And by that measure, Thomas Brennan was a truly rich man, a man who lived a life full of meaning and purpose. The forest remains, and in its permanence, it carries the history of all who loved, respected, and cared for it. Thomas Brennan is just one among many, but his story is special because he understood something fundamental. That man and nature do not have to be enemies, that work and preservation can coexist, that respect and responsible use can go hand in hand. As the sun sets over the Oregon mountains, casting long shadows among the pine trees, the forest whispers its stories to anyone who will listen. Stories of survival and sacrifice, of defiance and triumph, of men and women who dedicated their lives to something greater than themselves. And among these stories, there will always be the story of Thomas Brennan, the lumberjack who never gave up, even when the forest he loved tested him to his limits. This is your story. This is your lesson. And this is your gift to future generations. That no matter how dark it gets, no matter how difficult the challenges, no matter how many times you fall, you can always choose to get up. You can always choose to keep going. You can always choose to never give up.